Right, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to Breakout 3. So hopefully everybody was aiming to be in Breakout 3, so you're in the right place, if that was your intention. And really pleased to introduce this Breakout. It's quite close to my heart, actually. I'm a huge fan of the Wildlife Trusts, a trustee of Essex Wildlife Trust. So, yeah, very delighted to have this on the menu. And we're really looking here at sustainable sponsorship through the lens of a high-impact environmental partnership, which is the ambitious and impactful Jordan's Farm project, which is a partnership between Jordan's, the Wildlife Trust and LEAF that seeks to support nature to an impactful programme that demonstrates what can be achieved through true collaboration. So we've got two of those three stakeholder groups here co-presenting today. So I'm delighted to introduce Verity Wilks, Head of Procurement, Ingredients and Packaging at Jordan's and the Ryvita Company, and Emma Price-Thompson, Head of Corporate Partnerships at the Wildlife Trust. And the format of this session is they'll share a presentation with us around the project, its ambitions and goals and what it's achieving, and then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So with no further ado, I shall hand over to Emma.
I'm actually going to hand over to Verity, and I'm going to stand up. Great. Cool. Am I on? Yes, everyone can hear me at the back. Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us for this session. We're really excited to be here presenting, and it's a real privilege to get to present as a partnership. We've been working together for many, many years, as you'll see as we go through the deck. So great to be here together. So just to kick off, I work for the Jordan's Dorset Ryvita Company. We manufacture fantastically delicious breakfast cereals and also Ryvita. We call them savoury biscuits, but you'll probably know them as a cracker or hopefully just by the name Ryvita across the UK and internationally. But I think this partnership actually plays mostly to our Jordan's brand, so I'm going to talk primarily about that part of our business today. We have been pioneers in sustainable agriculture in the UK for decades. We were founding members of Conservation Grade in 1985 and have continued to work passionately in that field. And indeed, you can see from the brand purpose and sort of mission statement on your screen that we really believe that healthy food comes from healthy places, and therefore having healthy, nature-friendly farms as part of our network, providing those ingredients into our products is really key to who we are.
Great, and I work for the Wildlife Trusts. I'm very aware of today and previously, generally speaking, we tend to hear a lot about climate change, and actually biodiversity is the other side of the coin. It's equally in an emergency right now, and we can't look at one without looking at the other. And that's what the Wildlife Trust is doing. So it has a history of over 100 years. It is made up of 46 individual wildlife trusts. It's a federated organisation, so all of those wildlife trusts are independent of one another. And we have over 900,000 members across that federation. And we have traditionally looked at wildlife and nature, but actually climate, as I say, is the other side of the coin. And so that increasingly is part of what we're looking at. Our vision is of a thriving natural world with our wildlife and natural habitats playing a valued role in addressing the climate and ecological emergencies, where everyone is inspired to get involved in nature's recovery. So that does take us to both of those elements. Now, while development of land through building, such as housing, buildings for businesses, infrastructure, etc., has a huge impact on the amount of space there is for nature, farming has a really big impact. Farmland makes up 70% of the UK, and so the way that we farm is really, really important. I went to an event last night on wild owls. I don't know how many of you have been watching wild owls on TV on Sunday evenings. It's been absolutely fantastic, the latest David Attenborough. They had an event last night on business engagement, and Henry Dimbleby, who many of you may have heard of, and he set up Leon Restaurants, he was talking about the issue with farming, and how since the Second World War, the aim of that has been to provide everybody, the growing population that we have had since the Second World War, with the food that we need. But it was done in a very one-focused way, and it didn't take account of wildlife. And hence, we're now in a situation where we have depleted our wildlife, and actually the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, which is a little horrifying, really. So, as well as reduced space for wildlife, there's been an increase in agrochemicals and greater intensity of farming. And this has led to more pollution that puts pressure on pockets of wildlife that we have remaining. Agriculture is also one of the leading reasons why we have polluted rivers, which you will have seen in the press recently, and is really a big, big issue. So actually, often people will think of water companies and what goes on with our sewage, but in fact, agriculture can be one of those main issues that we find. And in the State of Nature report, the last one that came out in 2019, which is a report produced in partnership with 70 organisations who look at recording, researching, and conservation in the UK, they identified that there'd been a 60% decrease in farmland species. So, how we work with farmers is really, really important. And the wildlife trusts do believe that farming and food production can go hand in hand, and that now is the time to transform our food systems. And not only does that affect the food that we eat, but it also enables us to have healthier people. It creates that more resilient farming of livelihoods, prosperous rural communities, thriving wildlife, and a stable climate, we hope. So.
Great, thanks, Emma. So, in order to achieve what is quite an ambitious goal that Emma's just described, working in partnership is really key to that. And as mentioned at the beginning, there are three elements of this partnership. So there's us, the corporate partners, there's the Wildlife Trust, and then there's also LEAF, who many of you may have heard of, but LEAF stands for Linking Environment and Farming, and they are an NGO focused on sustainable agriculture with really strong guidelines on how to farm within the field in a way that is positive both for climate and for biodiversity, as well as looking after the habitat that may exist around the field itself. I realise that if I sit here, I can't see my notes, but I'll manage it anyway. So when we set out into this partnership, this three-way partnership, there were a number of things that we were really keen to deliver. And I think when you think about sponsorship, and actually I was saying to somebody over lunch, when I was asked if we wanted to talk at an event about sponsorship, for a minute I sort of had to step back and think, well, this seems strange, because I think of our partnership as being not actually sponsorship, much more about just having shared goals and a shared purpose. And my focus, I sit in procurement, has always very much been on, let's say, the supply chain elements of the partnership, rather than perhaps the outward sponsorship and sort of communications element of it. So I'm going to start there in terms of the objectives and then come back around. So one of the things that is critical to us is our oat supply. You know, we make breakfast cereals out of oats, and if we can't buy those oats, or we can't buy them at the right quality, then that's really, really impactful on us. It's therefore really important that the farmers in our network are growing those oats responsibly, are there for the future, are looking after their farms, the wildlife on their farms, the crops on their farms, all equally. So one of our key objectives when we set out was to ensure that we have those close relationships. So in order to, I'm going to have to stand up, I'm afraid, because it's otherwise I'm going to get my slides all mixed up. So in order to do that, we wanted to choose these partners, and then we actually went out to our consumers and said, of the various NGOs that we could have worked with, who resonates, who feels a good fit for us. And that was a really helpful way of picking partners or shortlisting partners, because it allowed us to hold a bit of a mirror up to ourselves and to our brands and see what people thought of us and who they were associating us with. And it was fantastic that the trusts were chosen through that process to be partners to work with alongside Leaf. So this began in 2015 and actually marked a transition for us away from conservation grade and into the Jordan's Farm Partnership. And what that allowed us to do was to create much more bespoke arrangements for each of our farms. So for those of you that have close links to farming, you'll know that we might think of a farm as a fairly standard unit, but they're not. They're wildly different in terms of the habitat, in terms of the environmental factors on that farm, and therefore what this program gives us with the Trust and with Leaf is the opportunity to have a bespoke nature plan on each and every one of the farms in our network. So having a best in practice system through Leaf about how to look after the field and how to look after the crop, and then having these really highly tailored nature plans that are delivered through the Wildlife Trust that allow each farm to really optimise the nature benefit and the nature value for them. Oops. Great.
So the Wildlife Trust works with 34 farmers involved in the Jordan's Farm Partnership. And as Verity said, they're all the oats farmers that go into the oats of Jordan cereal. And what you can see up there are those 34 farmers spread across the country, but certainly in clumps, I would say. Collectively, they farm nearly 16,000 hectares of land, which is a fairly substantial amount of land across the country. And as mentioned, the role that we play is to partner the farm advisors with those farms to help those farms look at what is the land set aside for nature. And the Jordan's Farm Partnership had a requirement that at least 10% of the land of the farm should be dedicated to nature. And actually, it's come up to 27%, which is really fantastic. And those farm advisors work very closely, as Verity said again, that each farm is very different. We have engaged 14 of our 46 wildlife trusts in this partnership, and those farm advisors come from the local wildlife trust to that farm. So they know that area, they often know those farmers and have worked with them for many years, and they therefore know the issues and challenges that there are with those farms. And they're able to help them on a bespoke basis identify how they can best develop the habitats that are needed to make up what should be at least 10%, but actually what ends up being 27% on average of those farms. And that habitat is there to increase the amount of wildlife that's on those farms. So we said that there's a 60% decrease in wildlife across the UK, and actually bird life has been one of the greatest hit over the last number of decades. And increasing the area for particular habitats that will support birds, but also pollinating insects, which are hugely important if we're going to keep our crops going, and also other animals. This is allowed. You will see in there some key stats, so things like hedgerow and field margins, which is where this additional habitat is coming from. And the valuable habitat, as I say, can be birds, it can be the pollinators such as bees and butterflies, but it's also things like bats. So it's quite a range of different animals. So in terms of our objectives, as with all relationships at the Wildlife Trust, we undertook a thorough due diligence process. before starting to ensure that we were building a relationship with a trusted and reputable brand, and clearly we identified that through Jordan's that was very much the case. And we also recognised the fact that there was great alignment between the two organisations in many ways, including their customers and our members. So the other element for us, which was very important or has become more important as we've maybe refined slightly our goals, is that the work that we do with Jordan's meets the Wildlife Trust goals. And we have 3 key goals, which are to ensure that nature is in recovery, to ensure that people are taking meaningful action for nature and climate change, and that includes making better decisions. So as we heard in the previous session, the more that we all know about nature and climate change, the better position we are in to be making informed decisions rather than just something off the top of our heads. And lastly, nature is playing a central and valued role in helping address local and global issues. And one of the areas there that we talk a lot about with our stakeholders is something called nature-based solutions, which many of you may have heard of, but can be anything from the pollinators that are needed in farming to the issues we have around flood risk. But more specifically, through the advisors, we're able to give the specific advice that we talked about that creates a positive force for nature's recovery. And that also, on the ground, helps us meet a 30 by 30 campaign. I don't know whether many of you would have followed COP15 last December, where a whole range of targets was identified for biodiversity, and one of them was that 30% of lands and seas should be protected and restored right across the globe. Now, clearly, we have to do a lot of that in the UK, particularly given that we are one of the most depleted nature countries in the world. So through the work that we have done over the last 7 years or something, Jordan's has become an exemplar relationship for the Wildlife Trusts.
Okay, so we share much of that vision, if not, I would say all of that vision that Emma's just described. But we do have a few additional individual objectives as well that I'll share with you. And the first I've already talked a little bit about in my confusion with my notes, so I'll try not to repeat too much of that. But as I said, it's super important to us that we have a really resilient supply chain for our main ingredient, and this programme and all of the farm resilience points that Emma just mentioned really played into that ambition. But we don't just need any oats, we also need oats that are fantastic quality. Our products are delicious, I hope many of you have tried them. And in order to make them that way, we need to have really good quality inputs. And what this partnership allows us to do is to build, I think, really uniquely strong relationships with our growers. Not only can we get out to farm and meet them, see the crop in the ground, we can also run trials. We can look at different ways of producing them. We can look at the inputs that they're using. We can look at alternative, more sustainable ways of cultivating the crop. So this allows us to build those relationships, and then once those relationships are established, it allows us to engage technically in the supply chain in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we were perhaps more of a unilateral actor. What perhaps more fundamentally this does is allows us to live our values and deliver our purpose. As I say, we've had decades and decades of intervention within sustainable agriculture, and as this agenda grows, so indeed our activities are growing, and we are now looking at projects overseas, and indeed have implemented a couple of projects overseas. So the opportunity to work with a partner who is as well known and as well respected as the trusts gave us that avenue to live our company purpose, which I think most of the speakers today have talked about. And then last but absolutely not least are who do we talk to about this? So although I said my lens is often looking at the practical side and the supply chain elements, actually being able to demonstrate that we are living our values, being able to demonstrate that we are doing the right thing, talking to our consumers, showing our shared beliefs and shared values, and inspiring our employees through taking really tangible, concrete steps has been a major objective of the partnership for us. And I won't say any more now because we're going to talk a bit about that, I think, later.
So we have a slide here for shared objectives. I think for the most part we've covered pretty much all of that off. The one thing that potentially I would say that we haven't mentioned so much, which I think is a very important shared objective, is that through increasing nature and biodiversity, we're increasing the resilience of the farmers. And that's resilience for nature, but that's also resilience for supply chains.
Absolutely. And then what is unique about this is that it's three-way in some ways. So even though there's two partners on the stage today, there are three of us in this together. And I think that what we have been able to demonstrate is that having quite a complex partnership actually takes a little while to set up, but once it's established, it really is impactful in terms of the scale of change that can be delivered. Our combined network, our combined knowledge is enormous, and we have been able to, alongside our farmers, who are of course the sort of fourth and perhaps most important partner, we have been able to demonstrate that through collaboration we can really implement change. And then the last bullet on there on the screen that you can see is that once this is rolling, it's sort of a snowball. So many of our farmers have taken their own initiatives, have gone above and beyond some of what we're asking them to do, becoming really pioneering and demonstration farmers in some cases. And that means that people are kind of taken to their farms to see kind of cutting edge practices of sustainable agriculture. And we hope that will allow those growers to sort of spread this message even more widely, just beyond the 34 farms that we have, and encourage sort of embedded learning and embedded change. So I think kind of growing the partnership even beyond us is certainly a shared objective. Yeah, I'm going to have a sip of water before this one, because that's a lot of words, isn't it? Okay. So how do we demonstrate our commitment? This is a challenging question in some ways, because we are such a purpose-led organisation that we're going to do this anyway. You know, we are invested in this. It's really part of who we are. But having invested in it, we do really want to then be able to tell people about it and demonstrate that, you know, our values are more than just words that we say, they're actions that we take. So I've tried to split this up into a couple of different areas. First, looking kind of internally within our organisation. Our employees are so motivated by this topic. It's sort of hard to describe in a way. I should have taken a video of the reactions that we get to conferences and kind of days out to farm. But it really does allow our colleagues to connect with our product in a way that they don't get to otherwise. You know, seeing it growing in a field is a very different experience to buying it in a supermarket shelf. But also seeing some of the habitat and some of the nature recovery that we see on our farms is really motivating, and I think just fundamentally inspiring for our colleagues and our employees. So we spend quite a lot of time talking about this internally. You know, it's never enough, but we talk about it a lot at events and conferences. But more importantly, we try to get out to farm where we can. You know, we respect our farmers, and we know they're not theme parks, so we try to do it all in proportion. But getting out to farm is a huge way that we are able to demonstrate our commitment and live and feel it in person. And then externally, there's a whole raft of people and organisations and stakeholders that are very, very interested in what we're doing, and that's really exciting for us. It's fantastic to take them out to farm and be able to hear lots of different perspectives, from DEFRA to other NGOs to other agri groups to customers, and really visit and touch and feel and understand what we're doing and how perhaps that might need to change in the future as things like Brexit affects our agricultural policies and affects farmer choices and what we grow and how we grow it. So we do strive to demonstrate our commitment to this through, I think, physical contact in some ways, getting out and about with people, but also creating content and sharing this in more traditional channels. Oh, which is what this is. Great, that did it without me pressing a button. Thanks, Emma. So I was just saying that we also do, we can't take everyone out to farm, much as we would love to. So we have some more traditional ways of talking about this and demonstrating our commitment through media assets. So we do, of course, use the Trust's brand on our packs. That's really important to us, and we have had that on pack for many, many years. The ones that are really developing and I would say growing exponentially is social media. So, we've got social media here today. It is one of the primary means of communication these days. We do an awful lot more, I would say, in the last 2 years as a partnership on social media than we ever did at the conception. And I think that is a really evolving factor for us. We also increasingly have interest from ESG and from government. So investors are keen to understand, what are we doing on this front? How are we looking at after climate change? What actions are we taking towards biodiversity? So we have produced content specifically for those types of events and those types of stakeholders. And then the last asset that I'll really talk about, I suppose, is the advice that we access from the wildlife trusts. So very different asset. It's not a comms asset. It's a technical asset, I suppose. But I can't overstate how important that is to our growers and how unique that is to this partnership. So being able to access kind of live to-the-minute advice from a team of experts has helped our farmers to implement this partnership massively. And they will tell you that it is harder to grow the habitat than it is to grow the crop. So having that access to somebody who can really help them, how do you establish a field of wildflowers? Anyone that's tried to do that in their garden will know that you might spread the seeds with lots of hope, but then nothing happens. They're surprisingly hard to get going. So that's an enormous asset. And then we track that. Periodically, we will look at the impact that's having on our associations of our brand. So are we being seen as a brand that is high in people's consciousness as being nature friendly and focused on wellness? So we get lots of assets from the partnership. Yeah. Oops. So finishing on that brand note before I hand back to Emma then, we have talked variously today about, how are we talking through sponsorship about our values and our purpose. There were some figures mentioned earlier about sponsoring things for years and years and years and still not getting very high recognition levels. I think that's a common challenge, but actually when you are engaging in a partnership for a multitude of reasons, which hopefully I've been able to convey today, that is one of them. It's a really important one, but it's not the only one. But actually what the partnership does allow us to do is have evidence points and proof points of who we are and what we're about. And over time, that allows our brands to develop a really deep connection with consumers, a deep connection based on emotion and higher order value, rather than just the fact that it might be available at the right shop at the right price at the right time, all of which is critical. But that deeper connection coming through shared values and evidence of those values is a real key impact for our brands. We do hope that it makes us distinctive. We know that increasingly other brands talk about activity that they do in this area, and we are very supportive of that. We would love to raise the base and to have more and more sustainable farming out there. That for us is just a positive challenge to go even further. But we also hope that it allows people to see what we are doing that's different. And then I think lastly, before I hand back to you, our ambition to continue to be thought leaders in this area. It's been many decades of working collaboratively. There's lots more coming our way in terms of science-based targets and new challenges. So we hope to continue to lead in that thinking.
So in terms of impacts on wildlife, so in the last year, where we've got the data, so in 2022, there were more than 4,260 hectares that were dedicated to wildlife through this partnership. That's almost the size of Oxford, so that's quite a large amount of space. And in polls that we did with farmers in 2021, 100% of them said that they had noticed that there was an increase in wildlife on their farms since they started the relationship. And they reported a visible increase in a range of species, from brown hares to bees to various birds, endangered bird species like grey partridge and lapwing. And after creating and extending the habitats of many of the farms, they reported first-time spots as well. So much wildlife has kind of pretty much disappeared completely from the UK, and it's slowly coming back again as corridors and areas are left specifically for wildlife. And so there are things like barn owls and bullfinches and otters that hadn't been seen for years, if not decades, and those are starting to come back. And one thing that's really important about all of this, which you'll hear a lot if you listen to people speak about nature and biodiversity, is that not only is it the amount of space that we're able to create, but it's the connectivity that you're able to create. So it's really important on the farms themselves that you create the connectivity, but also that those farms link up to things like wildlife trust reservations and to other farms that we may not be working with, or to people's gardens, so that those corridors that enable wildlife to move are incredibly important. In terms of measuring the impact, when farmers come online with us, we do a baseline report, and the farm advisor goes out, they check what's out there currently, so that in subsequent years they can go back and they can measure how much the increase in land has been, and also the wildlife. We've done growers' polls. I mentioned one earlier on where they have said that they have seen the increase. We do some awareness monitoring also, where we are checking with the British public. We check, I think it's about 1,000 individuals at a time, to see how that is changing as well in their minds.
And then finally, I already briefly mentioned, but we do undertake consumer research, both through an organisation called Euromonitor, who run reports looking at associations between brands and certain factors. But we do also run some of our own research after sort of before and after key campaigns, just to see if what we're putting out there is resonating with consumers. And I think one of the challenges, just perhaps preempting questions, but one of the challenges we have had is how to talk about this, how to get somebody in their home to relate to what's happening on farm and to wrap their heads around that. Perhaps it's something they've never themselves seen. So how do we get that message out there is a challenge, and that's why we seek to measure the impact.
And so finally, the partner evolution. So clearly the standard that has been developed to identify how the farmers in this partnership can go beyond what the baseline is the Jordan's Farm Partnership Standard that we have created. And what is really important is that we keep reviewing that and ensure that it evolves alongside expectations, and that we review it alongside how the government is looking at what is expected of farmers. We also welcome new farmers into the partnership, because farmers, like anything, come and go a little bit. And we also are looking at exploring a 30 by 30 pilot. I mentioned to you earlier on that is a global target that's come out of COP15. It's also one for the Wildlife Trust. It is looking at what does 30 by 30 mean? What does it mean for 30% of our land? We're talking about land at the moment. If you took 30% out of, dedicated 30% to wildlife, how would you do that? Who would do it? How do you make that kind of thing happen? So we're looking at something along those lines.
And I think as part of that 30 by 30 programme, how countryside management is changing generally. I mean, you're all from very different backgrounds, so some will be very sort of well informed on this and others perhaps less so, but agri-policy is changing, agri-incentives are changing, land use guidelines are changing. All of those things will impact growers, they'll impact their sort of passion for what they do, they might impact their farm P&Ls. I mean, ultimately, farms are also businesses. So one of the challenges for us in evolving the partnership is staying current. Some of those changes in legislation have been quite slow to come. So how do we understand the impact that landscape will have on individual decisions and then us as a collective? And And then I think finally, I mentioned right at the start that these issues to do with supply chain resilience, to do with engaging consumers, to do with climate change, they're not restricted just to the UK. So something that we need to think about as a business and an organisation is what are the learnings from this project that we might be able to extend into other areas.
Okay.
I think that's everything we had to share.
Hi, thank you for that. This is a question I think more for Emma. I work for Forestry England, so I completely understand what you're saying about the scale of the biodiversity crisis that we're facing at the moment, and it's been brilliant to hear about this incredible partnership. My question is more of a general one, though, and I just wanted to get your take on whether you feel like corporates and businesses that you talk to understand the scale of the crisis that we're facing and the level of nuance and investment that's required to address it and make a step change in that?
I think that generally speaking they don't. As mentioned earlier on, I think that businesses are really starting to get their head around climate change, and they're starting to make plans, although you see in the news that they're committing to targets, but they aren't yet making the plans. And biodiversity is sitting quite a way behind that. In my last role, I worked for a large corporate, and I was very interested in the impact that the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, I don't know if you've come across that, had on the business. So that's an investor-led initiative, and that had a huge impact on the leadership of the business. Because that was so successful, they set up the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that was set up about 18 months ago to 2 years ago. Now, I'm expecting that that is going to have a similar effect on the business community. But really, until that starts to kick in, I think they're generally playing around the edges, and the more I speak to people, and I was at this event last night and talking to a woman from Accounting for Sustainability, and she was saying, we're talking to all of our businesses, and they really don't have much idea about biodiversity. So I think there are little pockets where people have really looked at it, like Jordan's, but generally speaking, I don't think they have. And the resource that's needed is huge, absolutely huge. But there is, there's a lot of resource out there, and part of this is about just having the knowledge and working out how you're going to spend the money, and you might just do it differently. So with nature-based solutions, if you're building infrastructure, rather than building grey infrastructure, you could build green infrastructure. And actually that would give you far more benefits than you would get from the grey infrastructure.
Thank you. I just had a question about the farms themselves and the sort of minimum requirement they have, not just around land use they set aside for biodiversity, but also things like water use and fertilizer. And a sort of secondary to that, is there a sort of long-term analysis around the sort of financial viability, increased viability? I know it's long-term for those farms that have joined the program.
Yeah, good question. My hesitation is that I could give you a very long answer, so I'll try and make it more succinct. So I referred briefly and slightly vaguely to the kind of best practice guidelines that come into the partnership via LEAF. I didn't go into detail because it wasn't the subject for today, but it is the subject of your question. So what the farms follow is the IFM programme from LEAF. So if any of you have come across it, it stands for Integrated Farm Management. There are, I want to say, 12 elements to the standard. They include IPM, which is Integrated Pest Management, which talks to your question, also includes water, energy, but then as well as those, let's say, environmental elements, it includes community engagement and also kind of best practice business management. So it's a pretty rigorous and thorough standard. It's available if you want to have a look online in all the detail. I think they're on version 12 or something now, so it's continuously being renewed. So our growers have to be audited against that standard, and they are audited, I want to say every 12 months, but don't quote me on that, but regularly. So in addition to the audit, they also complete a self-assessment questionnaire every year, and that will ask things like, do you have a soil management policy? Yes, no. And if yes, which of these 10 practices are you participating in? And that will be everything from, minimising tramline passes in field all the way through to, using cover crops to improve natural nitrogen storage, etc., in the soil. So yes, there's a really sort of heavy-duty sustainable ag element to the partnership as well. The LEAF standard doesn't require as much wildlife habitat as our standard. So what we do with the trust is go above and beyond, both in the total area that's required, but also the quality of the nature-specific farm plans. So hopefully that answers the first part of your question. And the second part was around the financial viability. Yeah, so again, a long question, and I'll try to be brief, but all our growers will be utilising or maximising the commercial output of their land, be that crop yield an area or be it habitat. So we don't apply any restrictions to them through the programme. So if they've got hedgerows or woodland that forms part of the 10% of our obligation, they might also be including that woodland in an ELMS type programme and receiving funding for that same acreage from a different source. And from our perspective, that's fantastic, because no one person can fund what's required, and no one corporate can fund that either. So actually, if we are all asking growers to invest in these types of natural assets, then that is much more likely to be financially sustainable for them. Hopefully that. Yeah.
We have to wrap up there. Just finally, if there's no further questions, I shall just say a huge thank you to Emma and Verity. Thoroughly interesting presentation. A real shift of focus from today's other, obviously related specialists from the other content that we've seen today. So really great to have you both on stage and sharing that. So I'll say let's give Emma and Verity a final